Today is 9 June 2009. We're at the Isaac C. Griswold Public Library in Whitehall, New York. The interviewer's name is Wayne Clarke, and I am with the New York State Military Museum in Saratoga Springs, New York. And today we are interviewing Mr. Charles Brown. Sir, for the record, would you please state your full name and your date and place of birth, please?
Yeah, the full name is Herman Charles Brown, born May 5th, 1937, little farmhouse about a mile and a half south of the village line here in Whitehall. Went to school in the central school system. In those days, it went all the way from first grade to 12th grade, graduated from high school in the same Whitehall Central School building.
What year did you graduate from high school?
I graduated in 1955.
Okay, and at that point, did you go on to college?
At that point, I went on to about 3 years at Union College in Schenectady, New York. Prior to then, and prior to graduating from high school, setting in the school at the time, we were entertained by a Navy recruiter from the Glens Falls Naval Reserve Station, and I and two of my buddies decided to join the Navy Reserve at about the age of 17, just prior to our graduation from high school. And we joined the Navy Reserve, I believe it was in February 1955.
Did you go to any sort of basic training, or?
The only basic training that I ever had was through the Naval Reserve. At that time, we enlisted for 8 years in active service. We had no official obligation for active duty. We did a couple of weeks sometime during the year, specifically the summertime, if that was when we were available. And we went to a meeting in Glens Falls once a night every week. And my basic training was 2 weeks at the Naval Training Center at Bainbridge, Maryland, which is no longer there.
All right. And did you drop out of Union College?
After about 3 years in Union College, I decided to drop out, and I had discovered at that point in time that the Navy had a commissioning program, which was the Naval Aviation Cadet Training Program, to where a young man with at least 60 college credits under his belt, or 2 years of college, was able to go into this flight training program. And after extensive, about 18 months of flight training, we were given our Naval Wings of Gold and a commission in either the Navy or the Marine Corps at our choice. And I chose the commission in the Marine Corps.
Now, whereabouts was this training?
The training was conducted in Pensacola, Florida. All the way from basic, pre-flight to basic, and in outlying fields around the Pensacola, Florida area.
Now, what kind of aircraft did you train on?
Well, I started training in the T-34, which was a single prop reciprocating engine trainer that the Navy had. Then went on to their more advanced trainer, the T-28 Trojan, where I flew at Whiting Field for a period of time, which is on the outskirts of Pensacola. After the training in the T-28, I returned to Sherman Field at Pensacola, Florida, for training in multi-engine, that's this Beechcraft, for multi-engine training and advanced radio training. Then went on to what was considered to be advanced flight training, and became trained in helicopters at the time. That was in 1959. I received my commission in Navy Wings of Gold on the 29th of December 1959.
Mm-hmm. And what type of helicopters did you fly?
In active service, actually, at one point in time in my career, I was flying every helicopter that the Marine Corps had in its stable.
Mm-hmm.
I was flying and qualified in every single type that Marine Corps had.
All right. Once you completed your flight training and you were commissioned, you received your wings. Where were you sent next?
I was allowed to come home on 30 days leave, which I came back here to Whitehall, and then my first operational station was at the Marine Corps Air Station Helicopter, New River, which is adjacent to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina.
Mm-hmm. And what year was that?
That was in the early part of 1960.
Okay.
I would assume I arrived at that operational post about February. Again, receiving my commission in December, the end of December '59, with about 30 days of leave, and reported to active duty or active operational duty as a second lieutenant.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was probably February 1960.
And what type of missions were you flying at that time?
I was assigned to a helicopter squadron, which was then sort of a mixed organization. It was actually flying an observation type of fixed-wing aircraft, include also two types of helicopters, a Cuban, I don't recall the designation of that bird, but the helicopter that I was flying at the time was a Sikorsky H-19.
Mm-hmm. Were you flying the CH-34s at that point?
The CH-34s were just coming into the Marine Corps' inventory. The H-19 is a predecessor for the H-34.
Okay.
I transitioned into the H-34, I believe it was a couple years later, around the latter part of 1961, 1962.
Mm-hmm.
Now the interesting thing of the H-19s, I should probably mention, the first operational mission that I ever actually served on of any significance as a second lieutenant was flying an H-19 it was called the Good Friday Storm of 1960, which was a hurricane force storm, hit the Outer Banks of North Carolina. It completely tore the road system up, made new islands, separated the Outer Banks into a number of isolated spots, and a few of us was sent to the Outer Banks to assist in humanitarian missions at the time. Again, the Good Friday Storm. Some of the things that I remember doing is carrying a couple of pregnant ladies off in the island to have their babies in proper facilities on the mainland. Shortly thereafter, that episode, or it could have been slightly before that episode, I'm not exactly sure, you may recall that Fidel Castro had just taken over in Cuba. In early 1960, the Marine Corps was tasked to provide helicopters to fly the periphery at Guantanamo. The squadron that I was in was tasked to provide two H-19s for that mission of flying the fence line patrols at Guantanamo. The getting of the helicopters there was a little bit of a challenge because at the time that we were tasked, the weather was terrible. It was such an urgent mission that the Navy was tasked to move shipping out of Norfolk to transport, hopefully to transport us to Guantanamo. The shipping was moved. We were to load aboard a helicopter carrier off on the beach at Onslow at Camp Lejeune, but the weather was so terrible that we couldn't even take off and get from our base to land aboard the ship.
Mm-hmm.
So the exigency of the operation called for us to, as the ships were sailing south from Norfolk to Guantanamo Bay, we were directed to attempt to load aboard the ships as they moved further south. The way it was to be done was that we were to launch 4 helicopters with 4 crews, hoping that 2 of the helicopters would be in good operational condition to be able to make Guantanamo.
Mm-hmm.
It was not until about 3 days after we were to have embarked upon the shipping at Onslow did we actually take off from our base. The weather improves somewhat, so that we actually flew from North Carolina down the coastline, treetop level under the clouds. We were not instrument capable at the time. And we hopped from one island to another. Luckily, we found Charleston, South Carolina, refueled, took off again, went as far as Jacksonville, Mayport, Florida, still in the soup, in the weather. Luckily, we made Mayport, and at that time, we were able to catch up with the ships, and 2 of the birds went aboard the aircraft carrier and was transported. I was not one of the 2 crews that actually went to Guantanamo on the first effort, but we did get the birds there. Now, another interesting part about the plan was that if we had not been able to marry up with the aircraft carriers, the operational concept was to fly the helicopters as far as Miami, Florida, and then cross from Miami to the Bahamas, sort of hop, skip, and jump down the island chain going east of Cuba, coming around the southern tip and flying into the Guantanamo Bay. Now, how that was to be done, the Marine Corps was then flying transports, C-47s, and the plan was to have 55-gallon drums of fuel and oil airdropped onto pieces of sand so that we could stop in and drop in with hand cranks to hand crank and refuel ourselves out of these 55-gallon drums and get enough oil so we could finish making the trip. I thought that might be a little interesting anecdote to offer here. Even though I was not on a member of the first 1 or 2 crews that went to Gitmo, I did go to Guantanamo Bay later as a replacement crew, and I served on that mission flying the fence line in Guantanamo a number of times.
What was that like?
Flying the fence is just an observation mission, flying around in circles.
No incidents or Anything?
No major incidents, except that this might be a little operational anecdote. I hope Carol doesn't mind me saying this, but one of the missions that we had, we was tasked with while there in one of these periods of time. Our Marine sentries on the outpost gates started to come down with venereal disease, and it was discovered that there was a prostitute operation going on from Guantanamo City to where these women were being brought into the outlying areas. So the base commander decided to put together one of the first nighttime operations of the joint ground and air forces in the Marine Corps, and I was on that mission. We had big searchlights on our aircraft, and it was well coordinated, and in fact the mission was successful, and I think 1 or 2 boatloads were captured on that night operation. So that's another unusual little tidbit of non-published Marine Corps history.
And how much time did you spend down in Guantanamo?
I can't remember exactly the number of tours. They were not, there was maybe 3 months at a time, something like that, and you brought back. But in my early days of operational flying in the Marine Corps, and that was from 1960, I believe, until around 1964, I had determined that I was operational outside of the U.S. something like 85% of the time in those 4 years. It also happened that when I did transition and became qualified in flying the H-34, which was the new Scorsese bird that came in to take over the H-19. On one of my deployments aboard a helicopter carrier in the Caribbean with the H-34s, we were staying for a period of time at Roosevelt Roads in Puerto Rico, which is not too far from the island of Vieques, to where the Marine Corps uses a training ground. Even though the squadron had then H-34s, we were still maintaining the H-19s that were at Guantanamo Bay. And one of our pilots was, I believe, getting out of the Marine Corps at the time, and they were looking around to try to find somebody that was still qualified, and I was the only pilot then still qualified to fly the H-19, so back to Guantanamo I went.
Any other interesting assignments before the Vietnam period?
There was, I guess I should note that at one of my stays at Guantanamo Bay was during the period of time that we now commonly call the Bay of Pigs. So I was there in Cuba at that time of the Bay of Pigs operation. After my last stint in Guantanamo Bay, I moved back to my home base again, New River, outside of Camp Lejeune. And in the late spring of 1962, I deployed with a detachment of Marine helicopters aboard an LSD and did a 6-month cruise in the Mediterranean. hopping from one port to another, being shadowed by the Russians and stuff like that.
Hmm.
It was close to the end of that tour in the Mediterranean in 1962 that the Cuban Missile Crisis flared up. Our replacement in the Caribbean, the way the Marine Corps functioned with its deployment to the Caribbean in those days was a detachment of Marine Corps helicopters supporting a Marine Corps landing force on a 6-month rotation basis. So we would deploy 6 months and another unit would transatlantic and replace us,
Mm-hmm.
or replace the detachment that was there at the time. At the time that we were to rotate home was from that mission was the time that the Cuban Missile Crisis flared, and the Marine Corps was so short of pilots that we were not allowed to rotate back to the States and by transiting the Atlantic aboard the same ship that was to bring our crews and others across. We were picked up by a low-flying transport in Mallorca, the island of Mallorca, off in Spain, and actually flown. The pilots were flown from Spain back to the United States through Scotland, Iceland, and into North Carolina to be able to participate in what was going on at that time.
Mm-hmm. What kind of hours were you flying? I mean, were you flying just about every day during that period?
You're flying at the time of employment. I mean, deployment.
Mm-hmm.
You're flying every day,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't really say how many hours during the day that you would be flying. You'd be doing some training, you'd be doing some administrative flights, you'd be doing some test flying of maintained aircraft or your helicopters coming out of maintenance. So it's a pretty fluid type of a situation as far as number of hours being flown.
Now, were you flying mostly with the same crews?
No, you didn't. The Marine Corps doesn't operate like the Air Force. You're not assigned a specific aircraft, and you're not assigned a specific crew. The Marine Corps helicopter squadrons, generally speaking, are made up of having its complement 24 helicopters and about 50 pilots, and a squadron of, so I'd say somewhere between, well, I wouldn't even venture to guess. I don't know, actually can't remember the number of personnel in a squadron. But you are not assigned to your own aircraft. During the daily flight schedule, the pilots would be assigned to fly any one of the aircraft that happened to be up in operational capability at that specific period of time. So you flew everything you had in your stable.
Just have a question, like the H-19 and the CH-34. Do you recall what the common names were, like the Choctaw or Chickasaw, or similar names? Someone was just asking me what the designations were.
Yeah, I'm trying to. I thought it might be available in this book that I brought along, but.
Well, if it's not there, that's all right.
The H-34 was nicknamed the Seahorse.
Seahorse, okay.
Now, the H-19, of course, back in those days, the Navy had its own designation.
Right.
I'm using more the current terminology. The H-19, the Navy designation for that was the HRS. And but I don't have a nickname for that.
Okay. Now, at that point in time, how many flight hours did you accumulate? Must have been up there.
Well,
I mean, if you were flying just about every day.
I think my total number of hours in my whole career
Mm-hmm.
was probably somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you have to recall that, well, which we'll get into, I suppose, later. I did quite a number of staff billet tours, so
Mm-hmm.
that affected the number of hours that you were actually flying. But
Mm-hmm.
I was trying to recall. You're flying something like, I'm thinking 40 to 50 hours a month
Mm-hmm.
during that period of time. I believe that's a good recollection.
Mm-hmm. Did you become an instructor pilot also?
When you asked if asking that question, it causes me to. You're instructor pilots and you're instructor pilots. No, I never was assigned to Pensacola, Florida,
Mm-hmm.
as a flight instructor, as a instruction pilot.
Mm-hmm.
But once you become a helicopter aircraft commander,
Mm-hmm.
you are always in a sort of a training phase because it's a two-seated
Right.
aircraft.
So you're basically
flying with a co-pilot.
But you're the pilot in command.
I'm the pilot command, and
Mm-hmm.
and you're always involved in training others,
Sure.
including yourself. So,
Okay, and we're probably getting up close to your deployment to Vietnam.
I deployed to Vietnam for the first time
Mm-hmm.
in early 1963. Again, from the East Coast. In those days, I can't remember if we were the second or third Marine Corps helicopter squadron in country, but in 1963, our rotation was by unit.
Mm-hmm.
We did not move the hardware. We did not move the aircraft, but we trained for a year as a cohesive unit, and every person in that unit was under unit transfer orders. So we moved from North Carolina in 3 elements We left New River in 3 elements. We are all allowed 30 days of leave. We were ordered to then to El Toro in California, to where that's where we would come in off from leave, organize, move in 3 elements by Air Force transport straight to Okinawa. Stop in Okinawa and for about 48 hours, got all of your shots, and then move straight into Vietnam, to where we were moved into and operated out of Da Nang in Vietnam.
What was that like back in 1963? I was there from 69 and 70, but of course it was pretty well built up at that point.
In 1963, we were moved into Da Nang. However, the helicopter mission was then, in the early days, was shared by the Marine Corps and the Army. The Army had 1 squadron in country, and the Marine Corps had 1 squadron in country. The Army initially was assigned to the northern part of South Vietnam in the Da Nang area, and the Marine Corps was assigned into the Delta area around Saigon. It was soon discovered that the hardware of the different services had different capabilities. The Army's then old bananas were more usable in the low terrain around the Delta, and the Marine Corps helicopters were better suited for flying in higher terrain, such as in the jungle terrain that was in the northwestern part of Vietnam. So a switch occurred. The Marine Corps unit in the southern part was moved north, and the Army moved south. The unit that I came in with, I believe I think we were the 2nd Marine Corps unit in. In other words, we were the first replacement unit that allowed for the 1st Squadron to return to Okinawa. What was it? Technically, our mission was, we were technically trainers, yet we didn't do it. To my knowledge, never trained a single Vietnamese. We were there in the operation called, well, I can't think of the, Shoo Fly. It was Operation Shoo Fly at the time. And we were quartered and operated out of an old French military base with the French-style buildings and at the time. What was it like? Well, I've got in my hand a book called the U.S. Marine Corps History by Peter Mirsky, 1912 to the present. And this is the 1st edition. At the time of Mr. Mirsky interviewing folks for the writing of this book was in the early 1980s. And at that time I was the officer in charge of the Marine Corps Museum activities in Quantico, Virginia. I made a statement from that interview, which is quoted in this book, that in 1963, it appeared to me that what we were involved in was an Appalachian family feud. You know, the cat and the McCoys. But when I went back in 1989 and 88 and 89, it was truly war.
Mhm.
So that was the difference between 1963 and that. And that quote is published in this book.
Now, were you under fire periodically on your missions? And if so, was it primarily Viet Cong or North Vietnamese?
In the, now you're speaking, I guess,
In the early
again,
days.
in 1963, you really never knew who was shooting at you.
Mhm.
My suspicion is that it was more Viet Cong than it was regular North Vietnamese Army troops. We were doing a lot of resupply missions into various support bases in the jungle outposts that were set up to allow for safe havens for the villagers in certain areas. We did some movement of recon forces into areas that were protected by and had to be prepared for landing. They used we call them bungee stakes, large bamboo poles that were sharpened at the end to make it difficult for landing a helicopter in a small area. We did also did at the time some. We were in and out of Khe Sanh a few times again, but more organized South Vietnamese operations where we were providing air transport support for.
What was your impression of the South Vietnamese Army at that point?
In the units that I was dealing with at the time, we thought they were pretty efficient and proficient. I also have very high regard for the South Vietnamese Air Force, who were flying ADs, attack aircraft. And I remember being involved in a special operation to where I had air support from an element of the Vietnamese Air Force flying ADs, and when you see fixed-wing drivers providing close air support and then are flying lower than you are flying in a helicopter, they're doing pretty good. So I have, in those days, real high regard for their forces.
Did your unit suffer any casualties while you were there?
In 1963, I don't recall any casualties being sustained by those that I deployed with. We had assigned to us a detachment of fixed-wing bird dogs. I think you're similar to the L5 in the terminology, and I know we lost one of them while we were there because I was involved in a rescue mission attempting to recover that crew and that bird.
Did the crew survive that?
I don't recall.
Okay.
I don't recall.
All right. And how long was your deployment over in Vietnam?
In 1963, we had 3 Marine Corps helicopter squadrons in the Far East. We did 4-month rotations. It was a year deployment, 12-month deployment, and the way the rotation occurred in those days, we did 4 months in country, South Vietnam, We did 4 months sailing around the South China Sea on an LPH helicopter aircraft carrier. And the last 4 months was to be at Okinawa, supporting the Marine Corps division that was stationed there.
Mhm. All right, once you completed that 12-month period, so that would have brought you up to 64?
That would have been mid part of '64, yes.
Okay. Where were you sent next?
I was, from my first duty, from 1963, ended that deployment, I was ordered to Marine Corps Helicopter Squadron 1, HMX-1 at Quantico, Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
the President's own.
Okay, so you flew the president around?
I did.
You did, okay.
At the, when I was ordered from Vietnam in '63 to HMX, I was a senior first lieutenant, walked into the squadron as a first lieutenant, and in 1964, and 4 years later, I walked out of the squadron having as a major.
Mm-hmm.
While I was in the HMX-1, not all of the pilots assigned to HMX were trained in the presidential mission. I was one that was selected to be trained in the presidential mission, and I was one of 2 pilots that the commanding officer of the organization selected to be his co-pilot on presidential missions.
Mm-hmm. So, how did you get along with President Lyndon Johnson?
There's a photograph of me flying Lyndon Johnson.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right, got it.
I never personally met him.
Really?
I was lucky.
Uh-huh.
President Johnson was in true life somewhat different than his public image was.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that he was one of my most favorite personalities.
Okay, I'll leave it at that.
I think I'd leave it at that as well.
Okay. All right. Flying the president around, did you fly strictly in the continental United States, or were you involved in any?
I personally was not involved in any overseas operations in supporting the president.
Mm-hmm.
The areas that I was mostly involved when was naturally the mission of around Washington D.C., which also included the evacuation mission
Mm-hmm.
of the president and his cabinet and members of Congress. Of course, you remember that back in those days, it was still the hot war.
Sure.
The nuclear threat was there, and if you were involved in the evacuation mission, you were actually on the hot pad support, stationed with your helicopters at Anacostia, which is just across the Potomac River from the White House.
Mm-hmm.
And from the time that the bullhorn went off to the time that you actually had to be on the front lawn of the White House to be able to move whoever you were going to be moving, you had 5 minutes to do it. Of course, and the way that mission was put together. I can't remember the number of helicopters we had. It was either 2 or 3 on the hot pad at Anacostia, 24/7.
Mm-hmm.
And we went on and stayed behind the wire for 3 days at a time. And it was 48, 72 hours at a stint.
Mm-hmm.
And then we would rotate back to your regular job at Quantico, be there for 3 days, and then back in seclusion behind the fence for the next 3 days. That's the way it
Mm-hmm.
we rotated.
Did you enjoy that mission, or did you find it pretty hectic and demanding?
It was hectic and it was demanding, but it was quite enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in being selected to support the President of the United States, it's quite an honor,
Mm-hmm.
Regardless of who the person might be or what he turned out to be. You got to meet some pretty interesting folks. You got to be involved in some very intricate and detailed planning for various operations. Spent a lot of time at the ranch in Texas. You did a lot of preparatory work on training before the president would arrive in a certain location to make sure that you knew the landing zones and you knew the flight paths and to and from and
Mm-hmm.
all of the other intricacies of what might go on. I might mention that I am one of the few military pilots that's ever landed a helicopter on the top of the Pan Am building in New York City in both daytime and at night. We trained for that because of President Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
And a trip that was planned. He never did go into or come out of the Pan Am building, but we were prepared to do that for him if he desired it.
Mm-hmm.
That was interesting.
Now, what kind of backup did you have? I mean, if you're flying the president or any other dignitaries, did you have like fighter planes?
No.
No escorts, just a single aircraft.
You had backup helicopters
Mm-hmm.
that were shadowing you from the same organization in
Mm-hmm.
case something occurred, or they were positioned to where they could respond to some sort of an emergency call. In those days, the presidents did not want to be seen with a big flotilla of airplanes supporting them. And we couldn't even have the support aircraft within sight of being able to be seen out the window of the bird. So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's shadowing, as I say, it's shadowing, but it's quite a ways away.
Okay.
And sometimes they might not even be airborne. They might just be positioned to be able to respond. But it's not no tactical fighter
Mm-hmm.
cap or support was involved at all.
Mm-hmm. Once that mission ended, where were you sent next?
In those days, since to be involved in the mission, I had to have a certain level of security clearance, and naturally was privy to a lot of information that needed to be kept close to the chest. Those of us that were involved in the presidential mission were required to go through what was called a cooling down period before you could be sent back into an area of combat. So when I left HMX, I went into an administrative billet in the same installation for a period of time, but I was under orders to go back to Southeast Asia. So I left the squadron in around 1967, but I didn't get back into country until 1968. And that was right at the tail end of Tet and the tail end of, well, Quezon was pretty hot still. And when I went back to Southeast Asia, I was then again assigned to an operational helicopter squadron based at Quang Tri, which was the I Corps, the Northern Vietnam helicopter support base that supported the Quezon area, the DMZ, and that whole I Corps operation.
What were you flying at that point?
At that point in time, I had transitioned into the CH-46, the Chinook.
Okay. And what sort of missions did you fly? Was it mostly troop transport or resupply?
In the again the H-19, the H-34, the CH-46 all carried what was in the Marine Corps considered to be the a medium support mission. We did about anything and everything that anybody called on us to do. Included personnel transport. We had a capability of moving, I think, 22 Marines fully combat loaded at any one time. We did medevac missions day and night. A lot of recon, inserts, extracts, all sorts of logistic support, both internal and external slung loads. You name it, we basically did it. Other than fire suppression. Of course, we had our 50 cals on board, but we didn't have a mission such as our Huey gunships at the time.
Were you ever based out of Fubai?
No, I've been in and out of Fubai. In fact, in and out of Fubai both in 1963 and 68, 69.
Your second tour in Vietnam was mainly in the I Corps area?
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, both tours were in the I Corps area.
Okay. And
even though Da Nang is in the southern part of the I Corps area, Quang Tri being in the northern part of the I Corps area.
Now, how much did your missions change? Obviously, they changed quite a bit from 63 to 68, 69. What did you notice personally? Was it things obviously had heated up quite a bit?
Well, obviously they were heated up quite a bit. As I mentioned, my impression in 1963 was that we were involved in an Appalachian family feud that was going on, even though we were involved in some humanitarian support missions in 63, which made it quite self-satisfying of being able to take foodstuffs and things to the underprivileged, where you could see young children with malnutrition, with extruding bellies and things of that nature, so you knew that they needed some help.
Mhm.
Back in 68, 69, it was straight a combat, basically a combat role.
Right, the Quang Tree area was a pretty hot area, wasn't it, during that time period?
It was quite hot,
Mhm.
yeah. I, in the evening, after a full day of flying, sitting behind the hooch with a good cold can of Falstaff beer to try to cool down a little bit and let the sun go down, you were sometimes entertained by what do you call them, the spookies, the C-130s, C-47s that were flying the Puff the Magic Dragon support missions and spewing hot lead out into the ground.
How often were you hit with rocket and mortar attacks?
In the first 3 or 4 months, pretty frequently, but as that 68, 69 was a 13-month tour, and they sort of dwindled off towards the latter part of time. We were getting hit by both. Well, we were in an area that, because we were at a combat Marine Corps combat base that was pretty well spread around us. We were somewhat out of mortar range, but we were subject to the Chinese 122 millimeter rocket attack. So they came fairly frequently.
Now, you were in country for the siege of Khe Sanh?
I was at the latter part of the siege of Khe Sanh. I got into country in the latter part of April '68. It was pretty hot. In fact, once you, regardless of what your training and experience was, you went through 2 to 3 days of familiarization, flying with somebody else, and then after that period of time, which was brief, depending upon your exhibited skills, you were then allowed to fly as a helicopter aircraft commander. I'll give you an example. My the first day of flying in that tour as a helicopter aircraft commander in the Khe Sanh area, which was about, I'd say, you're flying 8, 9, 10 hours throughout the day. There was only one LZ that I went into that I wasn't shot at. And I'm talking 881 North, 881 South, 869, 991, Khe Sanh itself, in and out, mostly with slung loads, so you could move in, drop, and get out quickly.
Did your unit suffer many casualties?
Yes. I was in the squadron I was in at the time. From the time that I checked in April of 19. Well, the time that I checked in to exactly 6 months to the day that I checked out of the squadron, because my previous CO, who I had flown with in the presidential mission in Quantico, Virginia, was made a bird colonel and came in and took over the base, and I tried to stay away from him for a while because I knew if he knew I was there, I'd be pulled up on his staff, and I wanted to continue to fly.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was successful in doing that for about 3 days, and he caught me walking back to the squadron from the mess hall one noon. And before I got back to the squadron, the set of orders was waiting for me to join the staff. But anyway, what I'm leading to is that was exactly 6 days, 6 months to the day. And you recall my stating earlier that the Marine Corps' number of birds complement in the squadron was 24.
Mm-hmm.
In that exact 6 month period of time, we lost, completely destroyed in that one squadron, 44 helicopters. That's not the number of helicopters that were temporarily lost for whatever, and were able to be recovered.
Right, I'm going to stop you here. I have to change tapes.
Good.
Okay, before the break, you were mentioning about the casualties your unit had suffered, and you had lost quite a few aircraft and crews.
I mentioned that, the number of airframes that we actually lost.
Okay. Any other things you'd like to touch on for that particular tour?
I think the only other thing that, as far as my career is concerned, I mentioned that when I was pulled up on the base commander's staff, which was the Provisional Marine Aircraft Group that was at the air station at Quang Tri, I became the air station's installation officer and logistics officer, and that was the position that I held on that staff.
So
for the next the remaining part of my tour, 68, 69.
So at that point, you weren't really doing much flying?
You were still flying, but you were not doing as much flying. You were basically filling more of a. You're not any longer assigned to a squadron as one of its pilots, but you were still required to fly and to maintain your flying proficiency. So you had to fly various times during the month as you were available to do so.
Now, how long were you in that position? You mentioned till the end of your tour.
Well, it was a 13-month tour, so it was the last 7 months of my 68, 69 tour.
At the end of that tour, where did you go next?
During the period of time that I was in, 68, 69, and probably earlier, the Marine Corps was again short of pilots, so that Marine Corps aviators were not permitted to participate in the Marine Corps officers training programs such as your amphibious warfare schools, the officers advanced training back at Quantico. In the latter part of 69, that restriction was lifted, and I was one of 10 aviators that was selected to go to further training to the amphibious warfare school at Quantico, Virginia. That's a mid-level school, generally for the officers in the rank of captain, before they went on to field rank.
Mhm.
However, those of us that had already been promoted to major, the 10 of us aviators were all majors that were in that class. So I went back to school,
Mhm.
Quantico, Virginia, for a period of time, late 69, 70.
Mhm.
And then from my experiences at the Amphibious Warfare School, from there I was ordered to a billet to Headquarters Marine Corps, working for the Logistics and Installations Division of Headquarters Marine Corps, Deputy Chief of Staff for Aviation. How I got that set of orders was another case of my opening mouth, inserting foot. The curriculum at AWS had, over a period of time, had been evolved to be mostly for our ground Marine Corps officers, so that when 10 of us aviators showed up, the school really didn't know what to do with us. They knew that we wanted to have some exposure to Marine Corps aviation subjects. And one of the things that they did for us was took every division of the Deputy Chief of Staff for Aviation's office at Headquarters Marine Corps and gave us an introduction to the staff operations at headquarters. The time that we were spoken to by the colonel that was in charge of the installations and logistics division, it came, I sort of was waiting in the grass for him because I had just come out of that billet in a combat situation, and I had a number of questions for him. And I'm sorry to say that the questions were not answered.
Mhm.
After the formal sessions was over, we had sort of an informal coffee and donut type of get to socialize with each other, and one of his staff officers came up to me and he said, "Major, do you know what you just did?" I says, "Yes, I asked a few questions and I didn't get any answers." He said, "Where do you think you're going?" I said, "Well, my order says I'm headed for Naples, Italy." He says, "No, they're not. You're coming to work for me to answer the questions you just asked." So that's how I ended up at Headquarters Marine Corps.
Uh-huh.
That was in 1970, 71. And that was another somewhat comical experience. The program that I was assigned to, I became the Marine Corps' Expeditionary Airfield project officer. In the Marine Corps, our aviation assets are generally procured through the Navy with what we call blue dollars, not green Marine Corps
Mhm.
dollars. So I spent 2 years dealing with my counterparts in the Navy at the Naval Air Systems Command, writing letters, writing memos, making phone calls and doing this. And we had in that division of the Naval Air Systems Command, we had one Marine Corps liaison officer that served. Well, after 2 years of writing letters, the Marine that was in the Naval Air Systems Command billet, I believe he either retired, he moved on in some way, shape, or form, and guess who got sent to the Naval Air Systems Command to answer all of the letters that I had written in the previous 2 years? Well, you're looking at them. So I spent my third and fourth year within the beltway of Washington, D.C., answering all of the mail that I had written to myself. But
Okay.
little personal experiences that are comical sometimes.
And you were still flying, and
In those days, you still had to
Mhm.
maintain your flight efficiency, yes.
Mhm.
Mostly on training flights to maintain your proficiency. Um, I was while in Washington and in that area, again flying with HMX-1 back to Quantico, but not in the presidential support mission, but in various other little missions that they were involved in supporting the schools at Quantico and other little tasks that they were subjected to every once in a while.
Okay. And did you end up going back to Vietnam for the tail end, so to speak?
So to speak, yes. After coming out of the Naval Air Systems Command billet in, I think it was 73, 74, I'm not exactly sure what year now, I was sent from D.C. back to Quantico, a quick refresher training with a Marine helicopter squadron that was at Quantico at the time, other than HMX. It was about a 30, 45-day training session, extensive. Get yourself back into the saddle type of a thing. And then ordered directly back to Southeast Asia. Went to Okinawa, checked into a helicopter squadron, and that was based at Okinawa. Became its again it's four. That's for logistics officer. Not too long after arriving, the squadron was reorganized personnel-wise, and due to the fact that the squadron had a large detachment deployed from it on a training operation to Australia. So we had a good portion of our organization gone. With that detachment out, we were supposedly stable in Okinawa. But like everything goes, promises are sometimes that don't necessarily have to be kept. The squadron was ordered to completely deploy aboard an LPH. Of course, a part of the fourth position, the logistic officer position, is embarkation in the Marine Corps. So I was required to embark the squadron with a major element detached. And because of those orders as they came down, we had a number of our officers and enlisted men that were towards the end of their tour, so they weren't going to be available. So we had some major personnel changeover. We changed COs, which the commanding officer of a Marine helicopter squadron is generally a lieutenant colonel, with a senior major executive officer, and majors in the positions of operations, aircraft maintenance, and logistics. So I moved from, I believe it was the fourth senior major in the squadron, and into the position of squadron executive officer, and took that squadron afloat. And basically our afloat mission was sailing off the coast of Vietnam in the South China Sea. Not necessarily to be in position to evacuate what actually occurred later
Mhm.
on. The Vietnamese continued, but the mission that we were tasked with initially, which caused our deployment, was our prime mission was to be in position to be able to evacuate the American embassy and the American civilians in Phnom Penh, Cambodia,
Mhm.
uh, which never came to pass. But then the same unit in the same flotilla ended up involved in the Vietnamese evacuation.
Mhm.
But that was after I had already rotated back to the United States
Mhm.
from that deployment.
Okay. While you were on that deployment, though, were you able to get back in country at all, or did you just stay off the?
We stayed off the coast.
Off the coast.
We did not go back in country.
Okay.
No.
All right. And once Vietnam fell to the communists, whereabouts were you stationed at that point? You were back in the States?
I was back in the States. The from my assignment as the executive officer of that helicopter squad, my orders were to the Naval Aircraft Overhaul and Repair Facility at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point in North Carolina.
Mhm.
That was I became the helicopter overhaul and repair production officer responsible for scheduling and the moving of aircraft into and out of this industrial depot level repair complex. Not only was I responsible for production of that those tasks, but in that capacity I served as the primary test pilot for the aircraft coming out of that cycle.
Mhm. At that point in time, basically the military was being downsized, wasn't it? Did that have any effect on you or personnel you served with? Because I know a lot of career Army people were basically rifted out.
Well, this is 1977.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall any rift actions
Mhm.
or any impact upon reduction in size of force
Okay.
that I was experiencing. I was sort of out of the operational chain, so to speak, so I didn't really wasn't in a position to experience
Mm-hmm.
what was going on there.
Okay.
It was in at Narf Cherry Point where I was selected for lieutenant colonel, and being promoted out of the job of production officer into a top level management position at the facility. I became the facility's. The title was Management Services Officer. I was over the officer in charge over two different departments.
Mm-hmm.
One, I was technically the facility's comptroller, over their comptroller department, and their civilian personnel administration department. We had in the facility 2,500 civilian employees.
Mm-hmm.
And another part of that job, I was the senior management negotiator for all major civilian contracts with, I think we had 7 labor unions and I don't and a number of trade organizations that we were constantly involved in contract matters.
Mm-hmm. How long were you in that position for?
well, see, I said 77, that was 75. That was probably around 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, I was ordered to a billet in Marine Corps Air, back to the same Marine Corps Air Station that I started my career in, Marine Corps Air Station, Helicopter New River, outside of Camp Lejeune.
Mm-hmm.
For some reason, they were in a hurry to get another lieutenant colonel down there. I wasn't exactly sure why, because when I showed up, it was somewhat of a surprise, I think, to the CO, because I was an extra lieutenant colonel on board he didn't really know what to do with. So I ended up, the installation at the time was in the throes of preparing for an general inspection.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thrust with the task of coordinating and being the point of contact for the headquarters Marine Corps Inspecting General's visit. One of those great little jobs that you get every once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
All work and no glory sometimes. But after that was over with, I became the air station's operations officer for a short period of time, and then became the air station's executive officer.
Mm-hmm.
And served in that capacity up to 1980.
Mm-hmm.
In 1980, I was under orders to headquarters Marine Corps to initially assigned to work for a general who I had worked for somewhat fairly successfully something before in plans and programs. That didn't come to pass. I did end up under orders, but my orders were changed to become the officer in charge of the Marine Corps Museum activities at Quantico, Virginia. A headquarters Marine Corps billet, probably one of the best kept secrets of the Marine Corps, of filling a headquarters billet but not being at headquarters.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of your own independent command.
How did you like that assignment?
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
I've always enjoyed history,
Mm-hmm.
and being an aviator, it basically just thrust me into a position where two of my major interests in life had been aviation and history, putting them both together,
Mm-hmm.
running a museum. Officer in charge of the activity. I had a full staff of 34,
Mm-hmm.
self-contained museum. We did all of our acquisitions of artifacts, restoration, exhibit design, exhibit construction, and open to the public.
Mm-hmm. Now, did
Actually,
you
that activity is now what is known as the Marine Corps' National Heritage Museum at Quantico.
Mm-hmm. Did you have strictly military personnel working for you, or
In that capacity,
Mm-hmm.
in that, no, we had
civilians too?
curatorial staff was
Mhm.
was civilian. I had a sort of an exo that was military. My clerical staff was all civilian. Curatorial staff, as I mentioned, were civilian. We had 3 curators. The restoration unit was a mixture of civilian and military.
Mm-hmm.
The prime supervisor was civilian, and exhibit design and the exhibit construction was all civilian. And we had a docent force, basically a security force, which was Marine Corps.
Mm-hmm.
They served as your docents, and also as I said, security, meaning security of the objects, that hopefully you're not going to be ripped off by the visiting public.
What about your budget? Did you basically have an open budget where whatever you needed you got, or did you have
no.
to fight for it?
Oh no, you had to fight for every penny that you that you got, and you had to use your innovation of acquisition to do various things. One, especially if you're dealing with everything from buttons and medals and badges to airplanes and tanks and motorized vehicles. So you've got to keep attuned as to what's coming into the inventory, what's going out of the inventory, what may be available in the throughout the world if you're looking for something specific. Doing a lot of negotiations with civilian aviation units. Did a lot of swapping or trading of things.
As far as swapping, excuse me, you mean like aircraft or
Right.
four-wheel vehicles?
One, for an example, we worked very closely, or I worked very closely with the aviation units that are generally on the West Coast, but they are also operated in Pennsylvania. That's your, especially, you see them flying tankers in California when there's fires, forest fires or brush fires. There are specific aviation companies that specialize in those type of operations, and they're always looking for additional airframes, especially former military, that can be converted into something. And one of the ways that they use, or did in my time, used to access excess military airframes was working with the various museums. They'd go out and hunt for the old historic aviation relics all over the world, and if they'd come up with something that they thought you were interested in, they'd be on the phone to you. And then if it was something that you might be interested in acquiring and needed for whatever story you were going to be telling or intending to be telling, you got into some negotiations. That was very fortunate that the heads of the various services, aviation museums, had access to the boneyards of aircraft skeletons, especially at Davis-Monthan and around the country. You had to go through some approval processes, naturally, but it was doable.
Okay. Now, you were there until you retired?
Was there until I retired. I retired on the 29th of February 1984. So I only have a retirement anniversary every 4 years.
With how many years of service?
I actually did total service 29 years and 20 days. My decision to retire was basically driven by they wanted to send me back overseas, and I said, no way, I'm not ready to go back there. Been there, done that. Don't need to do that again.
All right, and what have you been doing since then?
Nothing.
Oh, that's
Giving Carol Senecal fits down here in Whitehall.
So I understand you've been doing some research here in Whitehall?
Well, I'm actually very involved in a number of gentlemen's heritage organizations in Vermont, the Society of Colonial Wars, the Sons of the American Revolution. I just love one of the reasons that I even came back to the area is that I just love the history, the colonial and the early history of this area. At one point in time, my interest was quite broad, but then the space in my library got sort of used up, so I've had to, over the last few years, redefine what my interests are down purely to the colonial period, which expires at the end of the War of 1812. So anything from 1607 to 1609, Henry Hudson and Samuel D. Champlain, or the founding of Jamestown down in Virginia, to 1815 at the end of the distribution of the military establishment that was involved in the War of 1812. That's the area that I've been focusing on.
Okay. Have you stayed in contact with people you served with in the military?
Somewhat, but not too much. I have no desire to go traveling around the country to an annual convention to drink beer with the old guys.
Okay.
It just doesn't.
Okay.
It just doesn't fit my need.
All right. Have you joined any organizations like the VFW?
Oh, I'm a member. I'm a life member of the VFW. I'm a life member of the American Legion. I'm a life member of the Marine Corps Aviation Association, the Combat Helicopter Association, the Marine Corps Heritage Association.
Okay. Sounds.
I keep it tuned.
Sounds like you've been pretty busy. How do you think your time in the service changed or affected your life? I know it's...
how did it change? That question takes me back to a statement that I know, in fact, Carol may have heard it. I don't think Bob has heard it, but my father used to say, my father is Frank Brown, now deceased. He used to say that as far as Herman was concerned, he never could get me out of uniform. Even though my dad was probably one of the leading pacifists of the area. He was not not military oriented at all. In fact, after my brother was born, he refused to sire any more children. So, of course, that was right in the middle of World War II, and he I didn't know this until later. My mother told me about it, that he just did not want to sire or raise any more cannon fodder. But he was very supportive of what I did. Very proud, I believe, of what I did, but it was sort of against his grain.
If you had it to do all over again, would you have made any changes?
None whatsoever. None whatsoever.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for your interview.
You're quite welcome. Picture, but
were you an Eagle Scout?
Yeah, with 44 merit badges. I was the third Eagle Scout in this community. That's that somewhere. You were, yeah. She was after me for some scouting history at one point in time. But, yeah, and not only was I an Eagle Scout, 40 some odd merit badges, one of the, this community, Whitehall, the whole community got behind sending me to, in 1953, to the Boy Scout National Jamboree, which was then held in Irving Ranch in California. Of course, my family couldn't afford to send me, and but however it came to pass, the whole community got behind the effort, you know, with the tin cans and the jugs out at every little store here and there. And the only obligation that I had from receiving that honor was to be prepared to speak to the various organizations in town that might want to hear of my experiences on that trip. And of course, I spoke to at the local Rotary, and I spoke to the Grange, and I guess that's about the only two that I can recall speaking to. Yeah.
This is Latin to you.
Oh, this Latin to you? Yeah.
What?
This is Latin to you?
No, I remember a lot of things in the paper.
Yeah, there was a lot of things. I still have all of those photographs, those slides. I took. I had a 35 millimeter camera, and
That wouldn't have
I still have a
influenced
lot
you towards going into the military, into the Marines. That wouldn't have influenced you at all. You already had some good training.
I don't think my Boy Scout experience influenced me in going into the military. Another thing that I was involved with at the time was at the Armory here in Whitehall.
You mentioned that.
We had there was an element of the Vermont Civil Air Patrol that was here under I think it was Charlie Bebo that was the officer in charge of our organization, and I think if anything that had any influence on me as far as aviation was concerned was my experience in the Civil Air Patrol here.
Now, did you actually get to fly with the Civil Air Patrol?
In fact, I've got a photograph at home of all of us, Len Rich, myself, a bunch of other young men and women, with a group photograph of the unit taken in front of a C-45 at the Rutland Airport. And of the two that I have a hat on, CAP hat, Rich has a CAP hat on, and he and I had the old seat pack parachute we were wearing in this photograph. So my experience in the Civil Air Patrol may have had some positive impact upon my, not necessarily motivation to be an aviator, but
Sparked your interest?
well, I'm not sure it sparked my interest. It just it didn't turn me away from aviation. It was a positive experience, something to where I might have been apprehensive about going into such a program. I knew I wanted to go into the military. I was not my college career was not the most successful in the world, so I needed to find my way in life
Mm-hmm.
with some different pursuits. So it, and my association with the Naval Reserve is where I found out about the commissioning program. And I don't believe that it ever entered my mind to become an aviator until I knew I wanted, I was going to go into the service. I knew I didn't want to go into the service anything other than as a commissioned officer.
Mm-hmm.
So I set that as a goal. And I think that the program in itself is more of an expediency to get to that goal, and becoming an aviator was secondary.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't, it didn't, the aviation element of it didn't, I wasn't scared away from it
Mm-hmm.
because of I'd had that associate, I had flown before and had some basic association with aviation from my Civil Air Patrol experience.
Okay.
More of a supportive thing than a driving force.
All right. Well, thank you.